Okay, today we're talking about conditioning sessions for football. Okay, so we're going to talk about two types of conditioning sessions that you will usually see and you will usually hear about. Uh, if you listen to any podcast or webinars, you'll hear about coaches talk about two type of days they have within a week. Okay, so the first type of day they have is what they call an intensive day. Okay, so what is an intensive session? So an intensive session is usually a session that involves a lot of accelerations, it involves a lot of decelerations, has a high eccentric load, but the distance covered isn't that high. So usually what this looks like is a session that's focused on small-sided games with variable grid sizes and variable rest times in between sets, with the purpose is to drive the heart rate up nice and high, so it's really intense. So you can do, like I said, small sided games and specific acceleration and deceleration drills. So typically you wouldn't go too much more than past 20 meters. So on an intensive day you wouldn't be hitting your top speed because you wouldn't be opening your legs past 20 meters. So this is really a day to improve your sort of repeated short sprint ability. And like I touched on in the last video about repeated sprint ability, that's really important for a team sport like soccer. Okay, so we're going to touch on the advantages of a day like today, the disadvantages, the considerations, and a few other aspects surrounding your intensive training sessions. Okay, so let's talk about the advantages of intensive days. Okay, so intensive days, I just listed 5 advantages of why they're really good to include in your week. So they mimic game-like movements. Okay, so in your like small-sided games and things like that, and things that are classed intensive, you have a lot of sprints under 20 meters, which if you look at the data around football games, most sprints are actually under 20 meters. There's plenty of decelerations, which trains that eccentric component and builds up the strength in all the tendons and the joints and the ligaments. And it has plenty of change of direction. So once again, something that's really important in an actual football game is our ability to change direction. So small-sided games train all these things if they're managed and coached well. So that's one advantage of an intensive day. Second one is it drives physiological adaptation. So let's just take, like I said, for example, a 3v3 small-sided game in a 30 by 20 yard box. If you have the drill set up that you have a constant supply of footballs, and you're constantly demanding out of players and motivating and pushing the players, it's very easy to get your heart rate up above 85% and keep it there for 3 to 4 minutes, depending on how long your games are, as well as developing that technical side of the game, so the players are on the ball all the time. So they're working really hard, but they're also playing a game, so it's developing almost 2 things at once. So that's another really good advantage of intensive days. But I have to say on that, and especially in small-sided games, you really have to manage it well, and you really have to push the players, because it's easy for players to almost hide in them types of situations and not put in the effort they would if they were just doing a running based game or running based drill. So it allows the players to develop technically, like I said. It improves players' tolerance and ability to sprint repeatedly with submaximal rest. So bringing it back again to repeated sprint ability, it almost trains that ability of sprinting, not getting enough rest, and then sprinting again. And it doesn't require too much space. So if you're limited to space and you don't have that much space for a session, an intensive day is easily set up. You don't need that much. You can set up players on the outside. If you only have half a pitch, it's really easy to set up, so you don't require that much space. So they're just the advantages. So we're going to touch on the disadvantages next. Alright, so when we're talking about the disadvantages of intensive days, they're not really disadvantages, but they're kind of just things that we need to consider as well. Okay, so in an intensive day, you're not exposing the body to maximum velocity. So if all you do is intensive days in training, so every training session is a small sided game, and is focused on that kind of like small space stuff, you're not exposing the body to maximum velocity sprinting. Why is that a problem? Is because if then you go out on a Saturday or a Sunday or whenever you have a game in 11v11 and your players have to sprint maximally over 40 meters, they're definitely at a higher risk of tearing a hamstring or getting some sort of injury. So you're not training that quality in intensive days and small sided games and stuff. Okay. Second thing is there's low volumes of high speed running, so kind of like the maximum velocity. So although there's a lot of accelerations and decelerations and short sprints, you're not actually getting over 21 kilometers an hour too often. So your sprint distance once again isn't going to be up, so you mightn't be as fit as you think you are when you go into a game and you're making longer runs. They can be physically demanding, these sessions, so the intensive days, because there's so much of an eccentric focus with acceleration and deceleration. It can really create a high amount of muscle soreness and fatigue, so you really need to be careful about when you do these and how much you're doing and what the player's kind of acute to chronic work ratio is. So have they been exposed to a lot of this type of training in the last couple of weeks? If not, you want to reduce your volume of it and ease them into it, because you can definitely create some joint and muscle injuries if you overload this stuff too much. And then the last just point is, if you're using small sided games, it just can be a little bit hard to control and monitor. So players can almost hide, like I said. If you don't have footballs readily and someone's serving them in, it's hard to get the intensity up where you need it to be. So yeah, so we're just going to have a little conclusion now on intensive days, and how you can implement them into your weekly plan. Okay, so to wrap up intensive days, okay, so we're going to look at a couple considerations before you implement these into your weeks. Okay, so the first thing to look at is the player's freshness. Okay, so you're more than likely not going to do a day like this the day after the game or 2 days after the game. Ideally you would do it 3 days after the game, when the players have had enough time to fully recover from the game and can give their best efforts. Similarly, saying that, you don't want to do a day like this any closer than 2 days really to the game, because then you'll have probably levels of fatigue that might hinder your performance. So that little sweet spot of maybe a Tuesday if you play on a Saturday, or a Wednesday if you play on a Sunday, would be ideal. The third point is player buy-in and motivation. So this comes down to if you're just going to do small sided games where the ball is involved, or you're going to just do a run and drill, where you repeat accelerations and repeat sprints. Why it's important is because if you have a group of players that are really, really motivated and have bought into what you're doing and really believe in it, then you could probably get small sided games, because you know they're going to put in the high amounts of effort, and really, really keep the intensity really high. If you've got a bunch of players that you know if you play a small sided game they're probably not going to work as hard as they can, then just using simple running drills is probably a better way to improve their fitness, because you can objectively see how much distance, how much sprinting, what times. You can set times on how far they need to get in a certain distance and stuff like that. Number 4 is just grid sizes. So it's intensive, so for small sided games you want the grids to be very small, so that there's a lot of accelerations, decelerations, they don't really get a break. Whereas if the grid is a lot larger, they can sit off, they can play possession a bit more. So grid sizes is really important, and also numbers. So any more than 4v4 wouldn't be considered a small-sided game. Progressive overload, so this one, are you overloading every week to drive your physiological adaptations to get your VO2 max higher, to make your players more resilient to the load that you're exposing them. So that's really, really important. So if you're doing small-sided games, it could be 3 games of 4 minutes on week 1. Week 2, it could be four games of 4 minutes, etc. And just build it up over the season. And then the last one is, when you're starting these, is players' acute chronic workload. So what have the players been exposed to in the week that you're doing it to versus what they've been exposed to over the last, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks. So if there's an acute spike in load, so if you do too much on one week compared to what they have been doing, you really can increase the risk of injury. So that is something that you really need to consider when you're planning your intensive days. So next we got extensive days. So I'm just going to go through the same type of situations and stuff. Okay, so next we're going to talk about extensive days. Okay, so extensive days are usually days where you cover a lot more distance. You do a lot more high speed running, so almost like striding and sprinting, but over longer distances. So you're covering a lot more distances. You have a higher exposure to your top speed, so you usually get up towards your top speed if it's programmed correctly. And the eccentric load isn't as high as an intensive day. So just some sample sessions of what extensive days look like. So large sided games, so 7v7s, 8v8s, 9v9s, 11v11s, in big spaces, to kind of replicate what happens in a game. Tempo runs, so runs that are above your maximal aerobic speed, so things that are classed as high speed running, and sprints that are greater than 30 meters, so all out efforts that are greater than 30 meters to allow you to hit your maximum velocity. So let's talk about the advantages of extensive days. Okay, so let's talk about the advantages of extensive days. So the first and main advantage of an extensive day is it allows the players to sprint maximally over larger distances, which, like we touched on earlier, will then help to reduce the injury risk a player then has if they then have to sprint in an 11v11 on the weekend, on Saturday or Sunday. So that's probably the main advantage of extensive days, and days that allow players to move quicker over larger distances. It increases a player's exposure to volumes of high speed running, so they get used to covering more ground at a higher speed for longer, like they would in a game, which will only increase their ability to perform on a game day. Tactics can be worked on in large sided games, so it's not like a 4v4 where you can't really work on your shape and stuff like that. If you're doing large sided games, you can work on your tactics and stuff like that. Now usually coaches, what they will do is they'll do an intensive day, an extensive day, and then they will do a tactical day as well at the end, where the intensity is really low and they're not looking at any fitness component. But if you only train twice a week, you could do an intensive day and then an extensive day where if you monitor it correctly, you can get all your fitness principles out of it, but you can also get your tactics as well. It doesn't fatigue the central nervous system as much as intensive days. Now, unless you're doing a lot of maximal sprinting, so unless you take the players out and do like 10 60-meter runs, you won't fatigue the central nervous system as much as you do on an intensive day. And it can help develop the player's work capacity, so it can help them build a really good base, which can then help them recover better from games, can help them recover better in games, and which can then help them sprint repeatedly better and more often. So they're the main advantages of extensive days. So like I said, you can use large sided games if you want to include the ball, so 77, 88, 99 over big spaces. If you just want to get that high speed running into the players, you can do things like tempo runs where they run at a lot higher than their maximum aerobic speed, so roughly about 130 to 140%. So they might do 100-meter runs in a certain time with 3 times the rest, or they could do Eurofit method, which is 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, but that's harder to keep a higher speed. So there's numerous ways of using extensive days with the ball, without the ball, but they're the main advantages. Okay, so let's look at some of the disadvantages of extensive days. So the first one is it's hard to increase your fitness without doing specific running sessions that might include the ball, so might be a bit more boring for your players to do. So in large sided games like 77s, 88s, 99s, the intensity is usually not as high, so players aren't working at as high of a heart rate as they would be in their small sided games. So to cover the amounts of high speed running they need to cover to increase their fitness levels, you might have to do your tempo runs and do your mass runs separate to your large sided games. So the players will need to understand that and buy in and understand why you're doing it. So that's very, very important that you explain why and that the players will buy into it. It doesn't expose the players to high eccentric loads, so it doesn't expose them to that high amount of accelerations and decelerations that can happen in a game. So you need to include an intensive day and an extensive day. You can't just do one or the other. Extensive days require a lot of space, so you probably need the full pitch to do these. Players get less touches on the ball than compared to small-sided games. So in a large-sided games, there's more players, there's more numbers, there's more space. So you're going to have less touches on the ball, so the players are probably going to develop a little slower. And maximum velocity almost has to be trained separate to the ball. So you can't, yes, you might hit high speed running in large sided games, but you're probably not going to hit maximum velocity. So you might do, but it's to get it trained in every player, you probably need to take the players separate and do 3 or 4 sprints over 40 to 60 meters with adequate rest, so they can tick off the box of hitting maximum velocity for the week and reduce their injury risk. Okay, we'll talk about considerations now of your extensive days, and then we'll just wrap up this video. Extensive days, considerations. Okay, so first one, like intensive days, time of the week / season. Okay, so the time of the week when you would do this type of day, so it's not that taxing, but you still wouldn't want to cover a high amount of volume the day before a game or the day after a game. So definitely don't do it the day after or 2 days after. Maybe 4 days after be okay, and try and keep it at least a day away, a full day away from your game day. Time of the season, so if you're in pre-season, you'll probably want to do a lot more high speed running in these type of sessions, versus if you're in season, it might just be more of a maintenance day and just cover some volume and just tick the box. And the player's acute to chronic workload ratio, so we touched on that in the intensive days. What have they done in previous weeks versus what are they doing this week? And especially when you're doing your maximum velocity sprinting as well, is if you do like 6 60-meter sprints at 100% intensity and the players haven't done a sprint in 4 weeks, you're probably going to tear a few hamstrings. Okay, so you need to build it up. So build it up to distance, so you might start with 40, then 50, then 60. Wouldn't go any more than 60. Build up the reps, build up the volume, so that the players have a really, really good tolerance to that high speed, that maximum speed running. And the same applies down with high speed running as well. So just, I'll touch on that, the difference between high speed running. So high speed running is kind of 21 kilometers above, where maximum speed running is the top speed you can get. So there is a difference. Space available, so how much space have you available? Have you only half a pitch? But then you're going to have to be clever if you want to do an extensive day. So you might have to incorporate some changes of direction in your runs and stuff like that. An extensive warm-up, so like you should do that with the intensive day as well, definitely. But especially before you go into maximum velocity sprinting, you really need to make sure you've warmed up the key muscle groups. And then minutes per minute compared to, or meters per minute, excuse me, compared to a game. So you could have an extensive day that lasts 2 hours and you cover 8 kilometers and you think you've covered a really nice amount of distance and it's been a good, like the intensity's been high and you've improved fitness. But when you break down and compare the meters you covered per minute compared to a game, that's how you judge your intensity of the session. So a typical game, you typically cover between 110 to 120 meters per minute. So if you're looking to do an extensive session, just keep that in mind based off what your goals are. Are you looking to go above that, or are you looking to stay at that, and what distances you're covering as well. So I'm just going to wrap up extensive days there, and we'll just conclude the video with a little conclusion of both. Okay, so my recommendations for intensive and extensive days. So incorporate both of them at least once per week if you can. So if you only train 2 nights a week, try maybe do an intensive day and an extensive day. So if you train Tuesday, Thursday, you might do intensive Tuesday, extensive Thursday, game Saturday, whatever. Weekly exposure to maximum velocity is a non-negotiable. Okay, so as long as the players are healthy and fit, they have to be constantly hitting their maximum speed every week if they want to reduce their chances of tearing their hamstring. So it's been proven that sprinting is probably the best prevention method for actually tearing your hamstring. Perform your intensive days when the players are fresh, to get the most out of them, to make sure the intensity is at the highest. And use a mixture of small-sided games, large-sided games, as well as your specific running drills that don't have maybe as much ball work, okay? So don't be, I'm all small-sided games, I'm all football always has to be in it, versus don't be the guy who's like, I'm all running, it has to all be running to improve your fitness. A nice blend of both of them will really improve your player's fitness, improve your player's technical ability, and will make your training a lot more enjoyable for the players and seem like you have a lot more of a understanding of what goes into creating a football fit player. So I really hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions or anything, just get in contact with me. So yeah, that's part 2 of conditioning for football, intensive and extensive days. Thanks for watching.